Well, hello, and thank you for watching this video on Jeremiah chapters 30 through 33. We finally come to this portion of Jeremiah that is the meat of the book. We talked about this several videos ago when we first started looking at Jeremiah. Jeremiah is really a comfort sandwich. And this is the overall structure of the book, where chapter 1 is about Jeremiah's call, and chapter 52 is about Jerusalem's fall, and those kind of serve as an introduction and an appendix on what's going to take place. And then you have the bread of the sandwich, which is condemnation. And you have a whole lot of bread here surrounding the very middle and emphasis of the book, which is the meat. And that is this message of comfort, this message of consolation to the people of Israel and Judah. And this is the main focus of Jeremiah's prophetic ministry. And as we look at these four middle chapters, the meat of Jeremiah, we could split it up into two sections. The first section is going to be that the promise of this future restoration. So Israel has been taken away into exile, and Judah has been taken away into exile. And Jeremiah is going to declare God's promise that they will be restored to the land, and in so many more ways, which we'll look at. And then the next portion in chapters 32 and 33, we're going to see the promise of restoration illustrated. And we'll talk about God giving an object lesson to Jeremiah to help reaffirm and show that God is fully intending to keep his word. And there's really nothing that anybody can do to get God to break the word that he is giving to Israel and to Judah, to restore them and to make a new covenant with them. So let's look first at these two chapters of 30 and 31. And what we're going to see here is, again, that the promise of future restoration declared. And so there's seven sections in these two chapters that kind of fit together. And each of these is the promise of, so that it begins with Jeremiah, the word of the Lord coming to him, and the promise of a future physical restoration, saying, hey, Judah and Israel will physically be returned to the land, and they will possess the land once more that they have lived in for centuries before being taken away. Israel was taken away by the Assyrian Empire, and Judah was taken away by the Babylonian Empire. God is saying, I'm going to regather them, and I'm going to plant them here once more in this land, and I'm going to grow them here. Not only is there going to be a future physical restoration, but God also promises a future spiritual restoration. This is a really, really amazing portion of chapter 30, because God is going to say, your wounds, which you caused, are incurable. There's nothing anybody can do to heal you. But then God comes and says, but I will heal you. Like, you can't heal yourself, but I'm going to come. I'm going to bind up your wounds, and I'm going to bring healing. I'm going to restore your health. And it's such a sweet promise of future spiritual restoration there in those verses. And then God also promises future prosperity in the land. He says you're going to build cities, you're going to multiply children, and things are going to thrive. We're going to have a Davidic king, and you are going to be in right covenant relationship with God. God says, I will be your God, and you will be my people. It will be as it was intended to be, going back to the garden and the nation of Israel under Moses' leadership coming out of Egypt. That's what they were intended to be, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God is saying, you will finally be that. And so he promises future prosperity in the land. And then there's this next section, which is in the end of chapter 30 and in the first verse of 31. It's really just 3 verses. But Jeremiah promises a future understanding of the past. Now, the end of verse 24 in chapter 30 says, in latter days you will understand this. So Jeremiah is promising that when the nations of Israel and Judah are restored and they are brought into right relationship with God, they are going to understand their past clearly. Now, even more clearly than they look to it now. They're going to see and understand not just their rebellion against God leading to their exile from the land, but they are also going to look back and understand their rejection of the Messiah, of Jesus Christ. In Zechariah chapter 12, verses 10 and following, you're going to talk about that same truth, that they're going to look back on him whom they have pierced, and they're going to weep and wail, and families are going to grieve that all that has taken place, but ultimately they are going to come to a saving faith and a saving knowledge of Jesus as their Messiah whom they rejected. So there's a promise of future understanding. And then the next two sections are going to focus upon the promise of future restoration of these two nations, of Israel, who was taken away in 725 BC, and the future restoration of Judah, which is being destroyed during Jeremiah's prophetic ministry. So those two sections speak about each of the two Israelite nations. And again, this is what would have been most shocking for the people of Judah to hear, that God is going to restore Israel, because Israel had been gone for 130 years. And so just the reality that they are going to be restored would have been an immense hope to the people of Judah, even as they were going to be taken away. And then all of this comes together, and the middle portion, and really these verses become the heart of Jeremiah, is the future promise of a new covenant with Israel and with Judah. So they had been in relationship with God based upon the Mosaic covenant. That, again, if there were blessings if they obeyed, and curses if they disobeyed. And all of this was established for them to be in right relationship with God. And God says, I'm doing away with that, and I'm going to establish a new covenant with Israel and with Judah in the future. And a part of that, the main emphasis of that covenant, we're going to see that there's going to be the regathering in the land. We're also going to see at the very end of chapter 31 that Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt and restored. But the very core of the new covenant promises are found in verses 31 to 34, where God promises that he will put his law within the hearts of the people, that he will teach them and instruct them. They won't need to teach one another anymore. And then ultimately, he says, I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. The promise of forgiveness and the promise of reconciliation with God, a new heart and forgiveness, that is the core message of the new covenant, which again is what we are partakers of. We are part of the new covenant community. These promises have been extended to the Gentiles, to the ministry of Jesus Christ. And this is the blessings of it, and this is the core of what was promised to Israel and to Judah, and we as a church have been grafted into those promises. So very key, important part of the Old Testament that's going to point to really the New Testament, and testament is really just another name for covenant. So very important, and something that's really key within that portion. In verses 35 to 37 in Jeremiah chapter 31, God is going to connect the fulfillment of his new covenant promises with the cycle of day and night. And God says, if you can break the cycle of day and night, that's all you have to do. Then you can get God to break his promise in the new covenant to Israel and to Judah. So it's connected there with the normal cycle that is unstoppable. And what we're going to see then after chapter 31 draws to a close and this promise is declared to Jeremiah, then in chapters 32 and 33, we're going to have God reiterate and reaffirm that these promises will come to pass, because when these promises are given, Babylon is knocking at the door. There was a 2-year siege of Jerusalem from 588 to 586. Nebuchadnezzar and his army come, and they are surrounding and preparing to invade Jerusalem, but they're starving it out. And so for 2 years, Jerusalem is under siege, and that's when these two chapters take place. And we have dates that are given in each of these chapters that tell us exactly when they take place, and they take place in the year 587 during the siege. Jeremiah is locked away by King Zedekiah, and he gets these two messages from the Lord. And all of chapter 32 is a message or an illustration that God will bring Judah back to the land. And God is going to tell Jeremiah, hey, I want you to go buy a plot of land. And Jeremiah is really confused. He's like, why would I buy land? Nebuchadnezzar has the city under siege. That would be a waste of money for me to go and buy land when an army's about to come and just take everything and murder so many people. Why would I buy land? But that's an illustration that God is going to keep his promise and that Israel and Judah will return to the land one day. And then in chapter 33, after building upon this illustration, God reaffirms the promise of future restoration. And the way that he's going to do this, he's also going to bring in two other covenants from the Old Testament that he promised as eternal, everlasting covenants. There were several of them. And he's going to link specifically in chapter 33 his covenant promises with King David, that David will always have a king on the throne forever. And then another covenant promise to Phinehas, which is the Levitical priesthood promise and the covenant that God would always have a priest for himself. And so God says he's going to tie these together. He says, I'm going to fulfill these promises to David and to the Levitical priests. And then, just like he did in chapter 31, God is going to connect his fulfillment of those covenants with the regular cycle of day and night. And God is doing this just to affirm that what he is saying will come to pass. There's a little bit of a gap right now during the church age, but there will be a Davidic king and there will be Levitical priests ministering before the Lord for all time. And so these are the promises that Jeremiah is going to give to the nation of Judah and to the nation of Israel, which had been dispersed. And this is the source of comfort to the nation of Israel, who have been under severe discipline of God. And just seeing how, even though they are disciplined and they are experiencing the discipline of a loving father at this time, God wasn't done with them. And I love what Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 14 talks about, and speaking about the spiritual restoration that's going to take place in the future. God says, I will feast the soul of the priests with abundance. And he says, my people shall be satisfied with my goodness. And I just love that picture, especially if you can remember back in Jeremiah chapter 2, when Jeremiah was just beginning to set the case against Judah and Israel, and says, hey, Jeremiah 2:13, my people have committed two evils. They have turned from the fountain of living waters, which is God, and they have hewed for themselves broken cisterns which cannot hold water. And now in the new covenant, when God works upon Israel as a nation and saves them and draws them to himself, they are going to find their deepest and greatest satisfaction in God. And again, what a blessing for us right now as we in the church, as partakers of this new covenant, that we can find that same satisfaction in God as well. And I hope that the Lord will bless and continue to lead you as you study Jeremiah, and that this message to Israel and Judah would also be a comfort and a consolation to our hearts. Thanks for watching this video from Ambassador Bible Fellowship. We exist to glorify God by multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches who believe the gospel, grow in Christ, and go to the lost. If you would like more resources on the Bible, theology, and church history, you can hit the subscribe button below or visit our website at ambassadorbiblefellowship.org.